Hey everyone, Abraham here. I am so proud to announce that we are officially an award-nominated podcast. Thank you so much to everyone who went to podcastawards.com and voted for us. If you're one of the lucky few who has been able to go for a second round of voting, please head back to podcastawards.com. We are in the Skeptic's Guide Science and Medicine category. Voting continues through September 9th, 2023. Please go vote for us. Thank you for your vote.
You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your diagnostically agnostic host, Abraham.
And I'm your anti-eugenics host, Shane.
Hey, we're a psychology podcast. We talk about all the things that people do, what animals do, what other things do, and why they do them, importantly. And that's why we call ourselves Why We Do What We Do. And sometimes what we do as a podcast is we will replay an old episode for you because we feel like it's time to dig it out of the memory books and revisit it. And then when we do that, we'll usually play that entire discussion in its entirety, as well as come back for some commentary afterward. And today I have chosen our episode on what happened to Asperger Syndrome.
Yeah, I'm excited about this because I was not on the original episode. So that's part of my favorite part of the nostalgia episodes is that I get to join on the episodes that I wasn't here for.
Yes, append Shane's voice to this, which makes it better.
No more FOMO for me.
And because this is a re-release of this, that means it has a new release date. And the release date is August 16th.
Yes, so today is National Roller Coaster Day. I love roller coasters so much, so we should do them more.
Yes. It is also National Tell a Joke Day. Insert joke here.
What do you call a fish with no eyes?
A no-eye fish?
Fish.
Oh, fish. That's right. I forgot that one. I forgot the punchline of the joke. All right. It's National Authenticity Day.
Yes.
That was an authentic joke brought to you by Why We Do What We Do.
Yeah. So I've been a dad for 17 years. So there's plenty of those lined up. So don't worry. It's National Backflow Prevention Day. So definitely want to avoid that.
Indeed. It is National Independent Worker Day. Which, is this the same as a gig contractor, like a gig worker?
Maybe
just someone who just happens to work independently.
Maybe who's somebody who doesn't rely on a lot of resources. I don't know.
There you go.
Or can get them themselves.
Maybe all of those things at once.
Yeah,
sure.
It's also National Airborne Day. So that's a historical kind of remembrance of airborne troops and kind of the history of that.
Yeah, particularly paratroopers, I believe.
Yes.
National Rum Day. So go get your rum on.
Key West is celebrating that literally every single day. It's Feeding Pets of the Homeless Week.
Hey,
that's nice.
So nice. Yeah. And it's National Smile Week, which you can do while you feed the pets of the homeless, perhaps while also drinking rum.
All of those things together. It sounds great.
Indeed. Prevent the backflow, though.
Yeah. No thanks.
Don't let the rum cause any backflow.
Yeah. None of that.
Although we were talking so much about all these different holidays, as I said, we're actually here to rerun an old episode for you, and we'll jump right into that fairly quickly. This episode was originally episode 24, which published October 25th, 2017. So it's been a minute.
Been over 300 episodes ago.
That is true. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. You get to sort of hear our humble beginnings, if you will, all the way back from 2017, which is great. And if you're joining us for the first time, thank you so much for being here. If you like what you hear today and would like to support the show, definitely subscribe so you can catch the fresh, brand new episodes that come out. And I mean, we're still adding new content to this, so it's not like you're getting nothing for here. You'll get fresh new episodes every Wednesday. Also, you won't miss any, and that'll be really good because we never miss any, so you never miss any. So it's a win-win situation there.
That's the goal. We try so hard. We work so hard not to miss any weeks for y'all. Like, we do so much to keep up so that y'all can get fresh content every week. So we hope that you appreciate it.
We do. It's a hardworking team over here. We're happy to do it because we enjoy the work, and it is a lot of the work.
Yes.
So we appreciate having you here. You can also leave us a rating and review that helps get the word out to people. You can tell a friend. You can also maybe invent a diagnosis and then later retract that diagnosis and call it Why We Do What We Do.
Yeah, why we do what we disorder.
Yep. I'll talk more about how you can support us at the end of this discussion. Oh, and then I should mention, maybe most importantly, you can join us on Patreon. And if you do that, you get all these perks and benefits and that sort of thing. But all of that existed, at least some of that existed at the time that we recorded this. Who knows? But I think you get to dive in, hear what Ryan, my original co-host on this, had to say, and then we'll come back and add a little bit of an update to some things that have actually happened since this one historical event took place.
Mm-hmm.
All right, welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I will be your host, Abraham.
And your co-host, Ryan O.
We are going to be talking about, this is kind of our first journey into this. We're going to tackle a specific diagnosis right now, but maybe in a way that you are a little bit different from just describing what it is. So specifically, we're going to start by assuming that most of you who are listening to this have heard of Asperger's syndrome or Asperger syndrome and autism spectrum disorders. Okay. Let's actually start real quick with just talking. Have you worked with individuals that have an Asperger's diagnosis, Ryan?
Yeah, not as much as people who are more like profoundly impacted by autism spectrum disorders.
Okay.
But I have worked with a few. And it's been a few years, man. I've been working out of that. I've been kind of sliding into more of a design role for other populations for the last like 3 or 4 years. So
okay.
I'm going to be a little light on my examples,
okay.
I think, as a result, just so I'm comfortable, you know?
Sure. And so I might provide some examples myself as well. I have worked with a few individuals that had an Asperger's diagnosis, and I, similar to you, also worked with a lot more individuals that had an autism diagnosis. But what we're really talking about today is just understanding what happens to this Asperger's diagnosis, because in case you haven't heard, in 2013, the Asperger's diagnosis was actually eliminated from the overall system of diagnoses that exist. It no longer exists in that realm, at least in the United States. And I'll get to that.
So a lot of diagnoses have a really slow kind of process of being kind of like described, talked about before they're kind of like turned into an official diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
So you actually captured some of this history I want to cover real quick. And that was, it was named after a pediatrician, Hans Asperger, in 1944, who was describing children he'd worked with as lacking social referencing skills, delayed language, as well as some clumsiness.
Yeah, so he sort of described them as being not very well coordinated. So this was quite a ways back in 1944. He didn't actually call it Asperger syndrome at the time. That term was later coined in 1981, or was officially described in 1981. It's credited to Dr. Lorna Wing. And so she was really the first one to describe this set of characteristics as Asperger syndrome. So that was pretty late. Like that's 37 years later that she did that, where it was officially published. And, presumably people had that description leading up to that publication, but that's where it's first credited to.
Yeah. And it wasn't even officially added to the American Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM for short, until the 4th edition of the DSM, which was released in 1994.
And most of these editions come with like a revision at some point, but we're not going to get into that. But yeah, so it wasn't until 1984. So now we're talking about, it's been 50 years since this was described by Hans Asperger, and 13 years since it was officially described by Dr. Lorna Wing. And it does finally show up in the American version of this DSM. And there are a lot of other countries and nations have their own version of a diagnostic manual that lists what they consider to be mental health disorders. And the DSM is really the American one. So that's the one that I'm going to be referencing the most, because this is where the controversy occurred. So I'm just describing the events that sort of led up to this.
Yeah. And so like many disorders, autism spectrum disorder included, as well as Asperger's syndrome, it's classified by a pattern of behaviors, right? So there's not a single behavior.
Yeah, that's the case for all diagnoses, is that it's never just a single thing. It's really more of a pattern. And especially for these types of disorders, the autism, Asperger's, there was a pervasive developmental disorder and some other ones. These have a really broad spectrum of things that they could look like. And that's why it's referred to as a spectrum of disorders, is because the way that it's characterized is just very different across a lot of different individuals. And there's never just one thing that happens where you can point to one behavior and say that this is going to be autism. And now I say that every one of them have patterns of multiple behaviors. While that's true, it is worth pointing out that some diagnoses are relatively restricted to a small number of behaviors that fit inside of a pattern.
Yeah. So can you describe some of those?
Yeah, so I'll just go over the actual diagnostic criteria for Asperger syndrome as it existed in that original DSM, the DSM that was published in 1994, the fourth edition. Okay, so the diagnostic criteria were that there was an impairment in social interactions and that this was manifested by failing to show emotional social reciprocity. So they weren't really demonstrating that appropriate reactions to social situations. They also failed to develop relationships that were meaningful with other people, and then really failure to develop the sort of nonverbal communication in terms of gestures and body language that we sort of adopt in our common culture. And that in addition to all of those things, that the level of impairment must be significant enough that it is clinically significant based on the fact that it affects how well they can function in sort of a normal society. The next one, so yeah, that was only one, was this impairment in their social interactions. The next one is that they had stereotyped behaviors. And so this is a kind of weird one that sounds weird because we're used to the word stereotype as meaning how we sort of generalize people into a single category.
Yeah.
But this actually means something different. In this particular disorder, stereotyped behaviors refers to these repetitive, restrictive actions. And so what this can look like is hand flapping, which is actually kind of hard to do. I've learned how to do it just because I wanted to see how to, but it's a little bit difficult. There's a lot of self-stimulatory behaviors. So things like kids will dangle shiny things next to their eyes is a common one, or they'll cover their ears because it creates an echo.
I worked with a kid that would press his eyes in certain ways with his knuckles. Yeah. Another student would tap his forehead, and just to kind of paint the picture, tapped his forehead to the extent that it kind of created this like thick, like leather-like patch over his forehead.
Man, that's intense.
4 by 4 inch square.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really intense. I actually did meet a kid that I worked with who was only about 5 years old at the time, and he had a stereotyped behavior pattern of rocking back and forth so much that he had just these like chiseled 6-pack abs at like 5 years old, because he was essentially doing like 20,000 crunches a day on sort of a minor level. But yeah, he just had this crazy well-developed stomach from this pattern. So yeah, most of these behavior patterns, they're pretty intense and they're often sort of an extreme level of something. And so sometimes it's something that looks weird, like these gestures and stuff. And sometimes it's something that looks common, but done to an extreme degree. And another one is being stuck on, or it's also called persevering or perseverating on single topics. So I worked with a kid at a center that I was at who had at the time an Asperger syndrome diagnosis, and he would always want to talk about the American presidents. He knew everything about them. He knew where they were born, the date they were born, when they were elected, just knew tons and tons of information. But he was really, really stuck on this one topic. He didn't want to talk about anything else. He didn't want to ever change the topic. He didn't want to be focused on other school things. He just always wanted to talk about the American presidents. Another one that you can see is kids will get really stuck on not necessarily topics, but on physical objects. Kids that will line up blocks in a very particular pattern or they'll stack them in a way. I work with a kid right now who he really, really just likes stacking markers.
Yeah.
And until they fall over and then just giggles when they fall. But he'll just do this over and over and over again.
I don't know if now's the right time, but it's interesting how like we're categorized these things because we can stack Legos all day and that's okay, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Or carpenters stacking bricks and they're building a house.
Mm-hmm.
It's if you just look at the activity of doing the same thing over and over and over again, it in some cases is functional. In that case, it's their job. In some cases, is totally not.
Yeah, and I think that highlights just like it needs to impact the quality of your life is kind of the idea, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is where it comes to the idea of it's clinically significant, is that it is at some point interfering with having access to a richer sort of life experience. Because let's say, for example, you spend all your time fixated on this one thing that you're doing, and then you fail to acquire other academic skills, then it's going to be really tough for you to be successful in school and go on to other education and maybe get a job that allows you to be more independent. And, that might be fine for some people. I'm not necessarily going to judge their life as being not meaningful, but the whole point is that you're not reducing their opportunity. So moving on. So that was only 2 of the diagnostic criteria I've talked about. I'm just going to go through the last 2 and then describe them in more detail. So different from Han's first description of the official US diagnostic criteria for Asperger syndrome is that it must not be accompanied by delays in language or cognitive abilities. Originally, when he described it, that wasn't part of it, but that was added later. that in order for it to be described as Asperger's, it should not have a delay in language. And then finally, then this is just standard among most mental health disorders. It qualifies for an Asperger's diagnosis if it's not more readily described by another diagnosis. And so just going back to this one about language, this is a very common thing inside of a lot of autism spectrum disorders is a delay in language development. And even in some of the kids with Asperger syndrome that I worked with, it wasn't that there was a delay necessarily, but they often had improper grammar or sort of like speech impediments or articulation problems that were accompanied with them, but they were developing language otherwise at a normal rate. They were having a lot of words. They were able to communicate effectively with people, but there were things that you could still notice in some of the way that they were speaking and using the language.
All right, so that's our definition.
Yeah, well, and that's going through like how it's diagnosed and how it's described by the DSM. At least it was at the time. And I have actually brought with me, not that anyone can see, but I have the older DSM where there is an Asperger's diagnosis in it, and then the more recent DSM where it's been removed. Okay, so we've described sort of what it is, and everyone always wants to know what's the cause.
It's definitely unknown,
Yeah,
right?
unfortunately, nobody knows.
There is believed to be at least partially some sort of genetic component, though.
Right. It seems to be rooted at least in some way with respect to the neurology and how the neurology developed, which means that there is some genetic component. Nobody really knows what that is. There have been a few genetic patterns that have been associated with some of those patterns of behaviors as well, but it's not very concrete and no one has any solid ideas. You can't like look at an infant that's in the womb, I guess a baby that's in the womb, and sequence its genome and then be able to really discover like this kid definitely has Asperger's or an autism diagnosis. That just doesn't exist yet. And it may not ever exist because we don't fully understand this disorder all the way. And it might be that things that we call autism or Asperger's or something else are actually just very distinct events, but they look similar.
Do we have to listen to ads? Yeah, I guess we do. Let's get back to it.
Okay, so question for you.
Sure.
There are some popular culture things that have maybe suggested this is close to savantism, or it includes these like savant-like characteristics. But you didn't describe any of that sort of stuff in the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah, that's a great point. So savantism refers to this idea of someone who has an extremely high skill or competency in some particular area. So they might get extremely good at math or painting or reading or puzzles or describing the parts of a train or knowing all the facts about the president. And so they reach a level of competency in a particular area that's far beyond that you would expect from your sort of average Joe, and even sometimes beyond what might be even considered an expert level. Like they just kind of know everything. And so that's the idea of this savantism. And I guess a similar idea is around like child prodigies as well. But there are some people that were diagnosed with Asperger syndrome that display these, the savantism. It's worth looking at what are the actual rates of that. And so one article that I was reading estimated that 10% of people with ASD would be described as savants, and which is to say that 90% of the people who would be diagnosed with ASD are not savants. 1% of the general population of people are described as savants, or maybe those prodigies.
So that's just in general,
Yeah.
like 1% of the population?
Yeah, so it's basically saying 10% of the autism spectrum disorders and then 1% of the general population.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so what that sort of speaks to is because it's only 10%, which is not a whole lot, I mean, it's higher than the general population, is that savantism itself isn't necessarily attributable to that diagnosis. For example, it could be the case that a savant individual is so focused on developing the skill that they're really interested in that they actually fail to develop those other skills. And so they might merit that diagnosis by virtue of, like, if they don't interact with other people, they might lack some of those social skills that would normally be developed under sort of typical circumstances. It's also possible that savantism is its own kind of behavior pattern, and it happens to share some of the similarities with autism and Asperger syndrome. It could be the case that many Asperger syndrome individuals could demonstrate the savantism, but they never really find that activity that piques their interest. So it would capture that. And so we just really can't say, but if savantism was inherent to the diagnosis of Asperger's, you would really expect those numbers to be practically flipped. Like it should be 90% of those people, or just a significant proportion of those people have it. But 10% is so small, it's hard to say what's the actual relation there.
So in 2013, the DSM-5 came out with a lot of controversy.
Every time another issue comes out, there's a lot of people who have some disagreements about what changed. This is just the main event that we've been leading up to this whole time, is what happened to Asperger syndrome. And so, as you mentioned, in 2013, they specifically removed the Asperger syndrome diagnosis and every other subtype of autism diagnosis that existed at the time. And what they did is they collapsed them all into a single category that they decided to just call autism spectrum disorders. And so, as you pointed out, this got a lot of people riled up. Essentially, the change that occurred in 2013 was that that diagnostic criteria for Asperger's and autism spectrum disorder removed the language and cognitive impairment part of the diagnosis and said just generally there was a deficit in skills related to things like social reciprocity and some of the other skills that were mentioned. The stereotype behavior pattern is another common one. And instead recommend in the diagnosis, when a child receives a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, that includes a specification about whether or not some other impairment was present in that individual, such as a language delay or a cognitive delay.
So I was looking into some different resources out there for like parents, clinicians trying to understand like why these changes occurred. And at one point, the DSM-5 revision website listed a couple of reasons as to why this umbrella term of autism spectrum disorders was kind of being used instead. And the first one was that the old way wasn't precise enough, and they cite or suggest that there was a lot of different clinicians or doctors that were diagnosing the same person with different disorders. And even if you had those same symptoms, you could come in and receive different disorders from like year to year. Really interesting, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then the other one was that it was claimed that autism is defined by a common set of behaviors and it should be characterized by a single name according to severity, which is what they ended up revising on.
Right. Yeah. To specify those, like what I guess deficits were present. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the suggestion on the DSM-5 revision website at one point. And I haven't checked to see if it's still there, but there's a lot of controversy around this.
Yeah. So we'll start with those people who recommend making the change to removing the Asperger syndrome diagnosis from the DSM and what their rationale is. And then I'll talk about the people who argue for it to stay the same. And that way we just sort of do an overall coverage of what the two sides are really saying.
Yeah. So we kind of hit the first one on this disagreement in the diagnostic criteria, right? And like the fact that people are diagnosing differently off of this definition.
Yeah, totally. That a lot of different people who were experts in this field couldn't necessarily agree on how to categorize it and how to set up evaluations to determine whether or not it met a particular set of characteristics to reach that diagnosis. Another one was there was this disagreement regarding whether or not there was really a clinical difference in making this distinction between Asperger's and autism and pervasive developmental disorders, because regardless of the type of diagnosis that you give it, the type of treatment doesn't necessarily change because it doesn't necessarily tell you what things need to be worked on for the individual because everybody is unique and they show up in their own specific way.
Mm-hmm. Another reason you might change to this new criteria was that tests for this were notoriously difficult to conduct and often result in invalid, inconsistent diagnoses. So really trying to attempt and make this distinction could take a really long time, sometimes years, and actually be pretty traumatic for a family, right?
Yeah. So, families are waiting to get services and it's so difficult to determine whether or not it was an autism or Asperger's or something else that they would try and do all these different tests and parse that out. And in that time, before they could receive a diagnosis, they wouldn't qualify for any treatment or at least no funding through their insurance companies to get treatment for their child. And so that's a long time to have to wait for nothing, where you don't really know what's going to happen or what you're going to get. And maybe you will get a diagnosis that means that you won't be able to receive any kind of services for your child.
Yeah. And those are such prime years. And that's actually been shown in the research, right? Those beginning years are so important. Yeah.
That's why the model really stresses the importance of catch it as early as possible and intervene right away. Because the longer this goes, the more difficult it is to sort of remediate the effects of this with therapy and so on. So another reason that people suggest that it's important to just sort of collapse these down is that there's this idea that if it's misdiagnosed, it could lead to interventions that actually make the behavior worse, such as incorrect prescriptions and incorrect sort of therapies that don't necessarily work for that individual. But I think that's kind of a weird one just because I'm not sure how, if you collapse it, that'd make it any less likely if an individual is showing up in one particular way. You just say autism spectrum disorders, where that would have been different from just saying it was Asperger's or autism before. I don't know. It just seems like that one's maybe not the strongest one.
Yeah. And many professionals also view this as like a quote mild or quote less severe form of autism. And emphasizing the quotes there for anyone that's listening that's been impacted or had a loved one impacted by this. But the idea is that it shares many similarities with autism, right?
Yeah.
So some of the things we described were like the stereotypical behavior,
Totally.
right? Totally correlates. Some of the social awkwardness, or like, how do I describe that?
A lack of awareness around cultural and social norms of behavior, insensitivity to people where things like emotional events. So there might be at a funeral or something, they might just not get it at all. That looks, very insensitive to what's going on in the broader social context. And that's all things that also exist for autism. That's very, very common inside of autistic disorders. And the last one that they describe that I found, and there are probably some others as well, but it's this fact that diagnostic labels and culture, they change over time. They evolve and they shift and they're kind of fluid and they're not necessarily all that static. And so how we interpret these behavior patterns and how we interpret these symptoms and how they manifest, that interpretation can change with more experience and with more information and with more exposure. And all of these things influence how people sort of regard those things. And on top of that, technology and the culture changes, which means that how those things manifest will also be a little bit different. So for example, 15 years ago, there weren't iPads, but now that's like the favorite toy of every child on the planet. That holds true as well for individuals who have one of these diagnoses. And so they might now have new types of that stereotype behavior where they become incredibly fixated on one thing. That's a video game that's on the iPad. Well, that wouldn't have been available 20 years ago. So there was no way that 20 years ago, people could have looked at that and said that this is a part of that diagnosis. It would have shown up in a very different way for the individual. So those kind of things just, they make it so that the way that this appears to people changes over time. And that can be really complicated for both the families and the individuals.
All right. So we covered that angle, right?
Yeah.
So why should this stay the same? Like, why should we not drop this or change this?
All right. So one of the reasons that families or individuals really argue that the Asperger Syndrome diagnosis should stay the same is that there's some concern that those children who are kind of mildly affected by some of these syndromes, or at least not nearly as severe as some of the other children are, they might not receive the diagnosis at all because they're, quote, not autistic enough, end quote. And so they actually maybe miss an opportunity for the appropriate treatment or intervention that is really necessary. And I think, there's an empirical question. We can see, are there kids who are now getting missed by this diagnosis because the spectrum seems like it should only target people who are more severely impacted? And so there's kids who aren't getting a diagnosis when they should get it. I'm actually not sure, but that is, one argument that this side makes.
So another angle is perhaps one person has both of these disorders, right? Autism spectrum disorders and Asperger's.
Mm-hmm.
An argument is like a treatment package would only be partially effective because they only treat part of the problem.
Right. So if you're looking at this and you say this is autism spectrum disorders and ignore maybe some other element of the disorder that you then put in this treatment, but it doesn't work all the way because you are missing some critical part of it.
Yeah.
And so that they need to be distinct so that you can make sure you're hitting all the relevant components.
And for me, that would make sense. That makes sense. But if it was collapsed correctly, then perhaps that wouldn't be an issue, right?
Yeah, especially if it goes after targeting, not necessarily this is the label is the important thing, but as it says in the new diagnosis, specifying what are the deficits for that individual. I'm not sure whether or not that would still continue to be a part of that problem. But I mean, I can still see this argument as, being a legitimate concern about this. Another one, and this isn't necessarily an argument for why it should stay the same, but they argue that it should stay the same and that to do so, they just need to refine that diagnostic criteria so that it really is not so difficult to diagnose. Is one of the major problems it was having before is it was, inconsistent diagnosis. So they were saying okay, well, that's fine, but this is still its own separate disorder. Let's just try and zoom in a little bit and really find those critical features of this. We can keep the same diagnosis and just refine the criteria for it. And then those things can maintain their distinction and we can, still continue to help that community.
So another one that comes up is that there's and this happens after, the 19 years or whatever it was in place,
Yeah.
officially, not even before it was being talked about before then, is that there's a large and vocal community of families of people with Asperger syndrome. I mean, people like identify themselves off of this, right? Like Temple Grandin.
Yeah. And if you heard the term, some parents like to call their kids Aspies if they have the Asperger syndrome. And so, yeah, this became a sort of a source of identity. And so in a way, it really felt like this was impacting those who identified strongly with that diagnosis. And by taking that diagnosis away, it was just saying like, your identity is illegitimate. It doesn't really belong. You're just a part of this other group over here. And that was difficult for families and individuals that are impacted by this to hear that and just say like, what are you doing? Like, you have no say in my life. I disagree, but they don't really have a voice in that. So I guess I can also understand that perspective of just feeling like once you have established this identity of like, okay, this is who I am, or your family has had that identity, and then that just sort of gets changed and everyone's like, well, we were wrong. Sorry, it's gone now. That can be difficult to sort of to hear, and also then to want to support, say like, no, like I'm not on board with this. This is just not how it is. So some have actually suggested that there are really dozens of different types of Asperger syndrome. And so that really begs the question, if there are these other types, then does there need to be like a subtype of Asperger's and then dozens of subtypes underneath theirs? Because what would end up happening is eventually you get to this end where every single person that could possibly have this diagnosis just has their own classification, because everybody's unique in their own way. And that's not to take away from the arguments that have been made so far. And actually, I think that they're very legitimate. But this idea of like, we just need to, you could break it down further and further and further. And so, although some people do feel that removing the Asperger syndrome diagnosis would sort of eliminate the identity of those people who really didn't feel like they met the criteria for autism spectrum disorders, but did meet that criteria for Asperger's, there actually have been specific people who have that diagnosis of Asperger syndrome who have come out and said, hey, my identity is linked with this autism spectrum disorders and autism in general. And so I don't care if I have it.
It was just getting good, and now ads. And now the riveting conclusion.
So that's another thing that's a little bit difficult about this, is that some people really feel strongly about this one way, and then other people who are a part of the exact same community feel very strongly about this in the other way, and for almost the same reason, but in opposite directions. So I don't know. It's I think a really tricky thing. So that was essentially the event as it took place, and what the both sides of it were. And so the next question to ask is sort of what happened. So in 2013, this just happened. There was the official system, and I think it's worth asking, what happened to those people who already had an autism spectrum disorder once this diagnosis was changed? And what actually came out of this from the American Psychological Association is that those that had that Asperger syndrome diagnosis were supposed to be re-diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that was according to this new DSM. Also, in addition to that, no new patients after 2013, after the publication of that diagnostic manual, will receive an Asperger syndrome diagnosis. Now, of course, there are probably going to be some people who choose to retain that label. Even doctors may choose to continue to record Asperger syndrome as the diagnosis, but that is complicated by the fact that health insurance companies may not accept billing for services for children with that disorder because it's not recognized by the American Psychological Association. So the overall response from the majority of the community has been just accepting this change. And I don't really have a personal stake in this. I don't know. Do you feel strongly about this either way?
I don't, outside of like anytime it disrupts services that are needed, like my heart kind of breaks.
Yeah, totally.
So that's where I know there's disruption in a change like this.
Sure.
So that's where I do care on like the micro level.
Yeah.
The macro level, it's a whole different story with diagnoses. They're tricky in general, to really get right. Like you see these things happen, like you see changes all the time and it impacts. Like we need to solve the macro level someday, but I don't think it's a conversation for here, nor do I have an answer.
That's fair. No, I agree. I think that makes perfect sense, is that, this will end up being a thing that happened in history, and eventually, we'll kind of move on with it and we'll look back on it and have whatever thoughts that were the fallout of this. It's only been 4 years, which isn't really that long a period of time in terms of the movement of research and especially the DSM, because they don't come out all that often.
I also think you don't have a lot of I mean, you can petition these sort of things. Large organizations can help, but there's also not a lot you can do at an individual level sometimes to influence this stuff. I mean, you can, but it's kind of, I mean, like you kind of have to accept it when it's kind of rolling out, right?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of is what it is. And I'm not, saying that people shouldn't, if they are really concerned about this, I'm not saying that they shouldn't try and do something about it, and just saying that that's been sort of what has happened so far. So,
okay. So
let's wrap
time
it up.
for some take homes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So first one I have are diagnoses in general aren't prescribed reliably. And it's a much larger issue than just in Asperger syndrome or autism spectrum disorders.
Right.
And it's something I'd love to be able to kind of tackle a little bit more sometime.
Just diving into what the DSM is and sort of its history, I think would be a pretty useful show.
Yeah.
Be pretty historically oriented, but
It's a blatant issue that like prescribing reliably has been an issue.
it's difficult.
And it's not just with this.
Yeah, that's very true.
And I get that it's a tough problem to solve.
As much as I see the need for having the label, everyone is their own person. As I was saying, like everyone's an individual and everyone has their own unique history and their own unique learning experiences and their own unique circumstances. And so these systems are meant to be categories. And trying to group things that are individuals into these categories is always going to cause some issues.
Yeah, this is where I kind of jump in to like piggyback off you. Like, most times when people are kind of asking me about autism spectrum disorders, Asperger syndrome, as like my history of working with that population is like, they're asking like, what's it like? I'm like, well, like that's always different. Like those things that you just described of different individual histories and whatnot, like that's how you need to approach someone.
Sure.
And at the end of the day, it's really no different than I mean, it's different in the sense of how you're going to help somebody and treat them, but initial like meet and greet and how you're going to say hi to someone, you know what I mean? Like it's all the same things, right?
True. You're
treating them as an individual like you would anybody else. So that is like, you can look at somebody for what they can do, can't do, what they want to do, what they don't want to do, what they aspire to be, etc. All those different things, just like we would anybody else.
And we'd try and help them in that way, regardless of what kind of label they have.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for finishing that. A couple other things to kind of take home is that there's real changes that do happen when these changes occur in the diagnostic manual, like services are lost, identities could be confused, right? Yeah. And then savantism really isn't exclusive to Asperger's. There is a little bit of an increase in the prevalence that we see, right? Mm-hmm. But that's also, I think, a misconception sometimes that I'd like to slightly debunk, at least outside of that 10 times difference for the general population.
Yeah, I had an uncle once who, when I told him what I did for a living, working with children with autism disorders and other intellectual disabilities, and he then proceeded to tell me, which, keep in mind, he's not a psychologist, he's never worked in the field, and he doesn't have any contact at all with the scientific literature, that, they're just people who are really intelligent and misunderstood. I'm like, okay, well, you're describing a savant, and that makes up a relatively small proportion of the population, but I don't know. It's kind of funny, I think, how people are about that sometimes.
Yeah. All right. So with that.
All right. I hope that we have answered the question you may have had about what happened to Asperger syndrome.
Awesome. So that was Abraham, and this is Ryan O. We are out.
Signing off.
Peace.
All right, so that was our discussion on what happened to Asperger syndrome. So now you have a bit more of the historical context. Maybe you didn't even know that was a thing. And if so, sorry to spoil that for you, maybe. There's definitely some people who would like that general description of it to fade away in time, and we'll explain why right now. Because as you sort of would, I guess, get from listening to this episode, what has changed since they removed the Asperger diagnosis from the DSM? Not a lot.
No.
That was like a thing that happened. It went into the DSM. It came out of the DSM. But there was a couple things that did happen. One thing that we didn't mention in the original discussion is the ICD at all. I think we hadn't even mentioned it yet. We did talk about that when we started talking about how to diagnose mental health disorders. And I think we talked about the DSM there. It may have been another discussion that we had, but I think that was where that came up. The ICD, though, actually added Asperger syndrome, sometimes it's called Asperger's, before the DSM did. So I saw two conflicting dates. One was 1991 and the other was 1992. So it was the ICD-10 when that edition came out. That was when Asperger syndrome was added. And then the DSM, it didn't come out until 1994. So it was 2 or 3 years later, depending on when that first date happened, which I thought was kind of interesting.
When the original episode aired in 2017, at the time, that meant that the Asperger syndrome diagnosis was still listed as a diagnosis in the ICD. In 2019, though, the ICD-11 eventually collapsed the Asperger syndrome diagnosis into autism spectrum disorder for all of the same reasons that the DSM-5 gave. So when we recorded this originally, the ICD still had it as a diagnosis.
Right.
It took another 2 years before it was collapsed into the full spectrum diagnosis that is ASD.
Which I think sort of shows you the different timelines of updates that happen to those different statistical manuals. Or I guess the ICD is not technically a statistical manual, but obviously the DSM was getting rewritten at a higher rate interval than the ICD was, because the ICD version 10 and 11 spanned in a time that exceeded by at least 4 or 5 years the entire DSM-4 in there. So if you see what I mean, like it was encompassed in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this. In my experience, ever since this change took place, the term Asperger and Asperger syndrome or Asperger's seems to have all but disappeared from the common lexicon among professionals and parents. Instead, what I've seen is if they're not just outright described as having an autism diagnosis, I hear the phrase they're on the spectrum as a way of sort of alluding to a version or that diagnosis as it may pertain to their kid, and a wide variety of descriptions of any autistic-like behaviors as being on the spectrum, which may be an official diagnosis as being an autism spectrum disorder, or simply a description of someone's behavior that they feel like looks like that diagnosis criteria. Have you had that experience too?
Yeah, I mean, I did have that experience, but the last few years, Florida has reverted back to the 1800s. So I'm hearing all kinds of really terrible things that are not even autism at this point in time because, Florida 1800s, real bad. That's the education level we're at here.
Gotcha.
I've seen a few pockets of folks that still want to hold on to the Asperger syndrome, that diagnosis, having that title. It's fairly rare. I mostly see it in like certain social media circles where people want to hold on to that. But for the most part, I don't really hear people using even kind of like the terms of endearment that you used to hear, like Aspie and stuff like that. You don't really hear that as much. You hear on the spectrum far more often.
Yeah.
Or just straight up, like with the last few years, you've heard kind of like the movement towards just saying specifically autistic.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say that too.
That's been, as far as keeping my finger on the pulse, that's kind of what I've noticed more than anything.
Yeah, similar here. But yeah, I think that mostly that term has gone away. There's maybe a reason for that. But yeah, so as we said, this came out in 2017. About a year after the original episode published, there was this explosion of controversy surrounding Hans Asperger, after whom, of course, this was named. We stated in the original discussion that Asperger's original publication was in 1944. Well, what else was going in 1944? Just a little something called the Second World War was coming to an end.
Yeah, that's all.
You may have also pieced together the fact that Hans sounds like a pretty common German name, so be prepared.
Ooh, yeah. So hold on to your butts, as Samuel L. Jackson says.
Yeah.
Hans Asperger's, originally given a whitewashed history of condemning the Nazi Party, was actually an active participant in the Nazi Party, although not a direct member. He was involved with them, but he wasn't a direct member, so he couldn't call himself a Nazi per se, but he was complicit. So in 2018, a culmination of years of investigation revealed extensive evidence that showed that he not only cooperated extensively with the Nazis, as an apparent eugenist, he was directly responsible for referring dozens of children with disabilities to a Nazi-controlled clinic in Vienna called Am Spiegelgrund, where these children were experimented upon and euthanized. And there's no evidence that he saved any children there. So, bad dude.
Yeah. Yeah, he's directly responsible for the murder of children who had disabilities or not. It's also, I mean, he is responsible, but they may have not all had disabilities. Not that makes it better or worse in any way. Just the fact that he's having kids euthanized is gross. But the reason I say that is because it's also possible he just didn't like some of the kids he sent there, rather than them having a specific diagnosis that sort of met his eugenicist point of view of things, or disability or disease. The Spectrum News reported a story of a boy that Asperger had referred to this clinic, and the boy's name was Leo. Asperger described Leo as a, quote, very difficult psychopathic boy of a kind which is not frequent among small children, end quote. However, the same boy, the doctors at Am Spiegelgrund, said about Leo that he was, quote, very well developed in every respect, end quote. So it seems like Hans here had just sort of a chip on his shoulder and was just sending a bunch of these, like dozens of these kids to this clinic where they, again, were were experimented upon, I think at a level that would quite easily be called tortured, and many of them euthanized. And that's just horrific.
Yeah, I mean, and we don't need to get into the, I feel like if you want details on kind of what was going on in some of these clinics and the experimentation, like there's plenty of stuff out there. I don't think that there's ever going to be a time where we're going to cover that in any sort of detail.
Yeah.
One, it's against the value of like, just talking about gore and horribleness that goes on with that kind of stuff. But also two, it's just not within our scope, I don't think.
Yeah.
So, but it's a terrible, terrible situation that I think that if you want to know more about, please go read about it, because it was really horrific. And the fact that Hans Asperger was directly involved in this type of thing speaks volumes of the kind of person that he really was.
Yeah.
Now, given the atrocities that were now associated with Asperger's name, many have suggested that we simply let it die and give it no more air moving forward. And I agree with that. I think it's similar to what you'll find when cities in the South start tearing down Confederate statues and stuff like that. It's very similar. Like, stop bolstering up and putting these people up on pedestals when they did really, really atrocious things throughout history.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like we just don't need to waste any more time on these people. They were not people we're celebrating. Like, let's just not celebrate them.
That's that simple.
Yeah, it is really that simple.
Right.
So, for those of you wondering, we had mentioned in the original episode and that the term Asperger, given the term Asperger, was originally described by Dr. Lorna Wing. And so for those of you who may have been wondering, did she know? Is that why she specifically went out of her way to call this Asperger syndrome? Well, as far as I can tell, and what research I was able to do, there's no evidence that Dr. Lorna Wing had any idea of Asperger was a eugenicist Nazi collaborator when she decided to specifically use his name, Asperger, for Asperger syndrome to describe that diagnosis.
Right.
And it makes a lot of sense because, I mean, we were just this was really just coming to light in the last few years. As we said, 2018 is when a lot of the story broke, and they had been doing research on this. But from what I could tell, most of the research into this started in 2005, and she came up with this in 1981. So there's really no evidence to suggest she had any idea. And as we said earlier, also at that time, a lot of people had sort of, Asperger himself included, done a lot of work to try and paint him as not being a Nazi collaborator, to try and sort of paint him as this guy who sort of unwillingly was there when they were there, but was even trying to save people. That was not the case.
Right.
The evidence that they've dug up has shown that he was very actively supporting their cause as a eugenist himself.
The fact that he was just sending kids to this clinic that he didn't like is just so shitty.
Yeah.
It's so bad.
It is.
It'd be different if he was under coercion and there'd be a different conversation and a little bit more nuance there, I think. There are plenty of people that lived under the regime in Nazi Germany that were so afraid for their lives that I'm sure they did some atrocious things. That's not excusing the atrocious things they did, but that is something to consider at least. And that's not the case for Asperger. He was like, nope, don't like this kid. Onward. And send him off and it's so bad. The more I think about it, just the more infuriating it is. It's awful.
Yeah. And not to add insult to injury, but here are some ads. And we are back. So that's what we have to say about new stuff pertaining to Asperger syndrome and what happens to it. A lot of stuff happens to it, but it is gone now.
Yeah.
As a quick summary, obviously you just listened to that discussion. Basically, they decided it lasted one iteration of the ICD and one iteration of the DSM, where it came in the 90s in both of them. It left in the 2010s of both of them. It did not exist prior to or after that, nor will it ever again. Or at least it's very unlikely that it will ever again.
Right.
And there's a lot that was going on around that, but there was initially this push. A lot of people at the fallout of having that change sort of said, we're just going to keep calling ourselves Asperger people. And I think that that's largely shifted. I think that what has happened is that it is simply autism spectrum disorder, which is fine. I think it's perfectly reasonable to just collapse them down into that for all the reasons that they gave.
Right.
But that's where we find it. So
I think that's good. I think that's fine.
So I hope that you enjoyed this nostalgic look at our previous episode on what happened to Asperger syndrome. I would like to thank everyone who is here listening to this. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for recording with me today, Shane.
Of course.
Generally, just to, giving credit where credit is due, the people who make this show happen, Writing and fact checking from Shane and myself, production and editing from Justin, and our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson. Thank you all so much to my team. As I mentioned, if you join us on Patreon, you'll get access to uncut versions of these episodes or unedited versions where we cut it. We leave in all the things that we had to fix and change, or that we asked Justin to fix and change and post, and he did a wonderful job. And that's why you're able to listen to this.
Yes.
Otherwise, just so messy. And in addition to that, you could get access to notes, early releases of episodes, ad-free versions of episodes, all that stuff. So go check that out. If we get to enough patrons, we'll be doing a hangout with y'all on like Zoom or something like that. Maybe Facebook groups or wherever people go to hang out online these days. We'll do something like that. And in addition, I was kind of thinking we might kick around some other ideas for ways that we can sort of just work, or we can hang out, spend a little more time with our patrons. I think would be kind of cool.
Yeah, it'll be great.
At the end of every episode now, we didn't do this back when we originally recorded this episode, but now what we like to do is give some recommendations. And so let me quickly also point out that the people who do support us on Patreon, they get a little extra love. And because these are people who they're here with us and they're amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And that is Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, and Ashley. Thank you all so much for joining us on Patreon and for supporting the show. You guys are wonderful.
So great.
But I was saying that we get to recommendations. We tell you recommendations. Let's do our recommendations.
Recommendation.
Recommendations.
I'm going to go first because I think yours will be more specifically directable. Where I live at the time that I'm recording this, we just recently had a garlic festival, which is what it sounds like. It is mostly local growers who come around to share their garlic. They also will invite a bunch of food trucks that can sort of bring their own garlic themed twist on some of their recipes, and they'll line up. And it's just this cool event that celebrates garlic. And I've given to understand that a lot of cities have garlic festivals. So my recommendation is to go check out your local garlic festival. They're a blast. And who doesn't love garlic? Vampires, I guess.
Yeah, vampires. Dracula, not a big fan. Lestat, no thanks. But
Exactly.
other people do. Other people like garlic, and I too like garlic. So, which is nice because that means I'm not a vampire.
That is nice. And for that reason,
I can go out in the sun and I can eat garlic. So, so far, so good is what I would say.
you can kind of go out in the sun. You
Yeah, it hurts. It does hurt.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm a familiar. I don't know. So.
There you go.
I don't know. I have no recollection. That's a good recommendation. I like that. I'll have to see if my city has it. I would think it would be really fun to have like a garlic festival on the beach. Like that seems like it would be really nice. So speaking of food, I have recently discovered, I don't want to say discovered, I have known about the show, but I never gave it a chance to watch it. And that is a show called The Bear. Have you watched The Bear at all?
No, I don't even think I've heard of this one.
It's so good. It's very gritty and realistic. So the story is, and I'm only 3 episodes in, so I'm sure I'm going to discover more and stuff like that. So if you've seen it, I know. Don't spoil it for me. I'm watching it right now. But the show goes that this guy, he has taken over his brother's restaurant. His brother had committed suicide, and so he's taken over his brother's restaurant. And the story kind of unfolds that the guy that's running it, and the main character is a kid named Carmen, and he's played by Jeremy Allen White, who is just basically like Gene Wilder. He looks exactly like Gene Wilder,
Wow.
younger Gene Wilder.
Cool.
And he's really good in it. Like he's like, you totally feel for this kid. Because he's trying to fix his brother's restaurant that he inherited because his brother committed suicide. And so he's kind of come in as like this like well-trained culinary chef in this place that sells like beef and peppers, like these like it's like a Chicago style, like really shitty dive bar kind of restaurant.
Sure.
Like very like hole in the wall.
Yeah.
The whole thing is like all the tension between all the people and like how he runs the place and how he's coping with everything and dealing with it. It's just really, it feels very human. And I feel like having worked in like really tough family restaurants, they nail the feeling of like things going wrong, managers being assholes, people like treating each other with like love and respect, but also like just breaking each other's balls and stuff like that. Like,
Sure.
you know, I think it's really a great show. I am obsessed with it right now.
Wow. Okay. That sounds like fun.
Yeah, it's so good.
Did you say what platform it's on?
It is on Hulu. It's
Okay.
an FX show. So it might also be on Disney. I don't know. But I know for sure it's on Hulu.
Okay.
So
Awesome. That sounds fun. How many seasons does it have now?
So it just came out with a second season. There are only 18 episodes, and every episode is only 30 minutes long.
Oh, okay. So it's a quick one, easy to get through.
So it's a super easy watch. And it's also completely uncensored. So like it's very like it's a lot of like people going, you know, you like doing that a lot in the kitchens. It's great.
For those of you hearing this, not the unedited version, Shane just swore.
A couple times.
So through my what little bit of sleuthing I was able to do, there is a garlic festival in Miami. It's North Miami, but it's down in Miami, so it's not super close to you. It does seem like it's a pretty long one. I couldn't find one in Daytona specifically.
Okay.
But I would, I probably did not do a very good job. So you should look around and see if you find anything and report back so that our other listener in Daytona will know.
I'll keep you posted for sure.
Cool. But otherwise, people can go check it out. And also, you might look Garlic Fest and Garlic Festival. I saw it written a couple different ways depending on where you were looking. So
okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, I think mine is actually Garlic Fest and not Festival, and I said Garlic Festival, and I think that's maybe a different thing.
Okay,
so
that makes sense.
Yeah. Anyway. All right. Thank you so much for everyone listening. I think that is all that I have to say. Anything that you would like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think that covers it.
Perfect. All right. Well, if you have any thoughts or anything you'd like to share with us, we like hearing from people.
And it's
Email us at info@wwdpodcast.com or reach out to us on the major non-crazy social media platforms.
Yes.
Including apparently X. We're not on X.
Yeah, whatever that is.
You can find us in the normal places though. But I think that's all I have. So this is Abraham. We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.